Scary telling.
I was almost 5 years old when my little brother Nathan was born. At first, I was excited to have a new addition to our family, but as time went on, I became jealous of all the attention he was getting from our parents. Being an only child up until then, I was used to having all of their love and affection directed towards me. But suddenly, everything became all about Nathan. I tried to be happy for my parents, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was taking away their love from me. They were so focused on his needs and development that they didn't seem to have time for me anymore. I felt neglected and left out. As Nathan grew older, his cerebral palsy became more apparent, and my parents' attention was even more concentrated on him. They were constantly discussing his care, his progress, and his future. Meanwhile, I felt like I was invisible. No one cared about my achievements or interests anymore. My 6th birthday was the turning point. I had been looking forward to it for weeks, but when the day finally arrived, it was all about Nathan. He fell off his high chair and got a big cut on his forehead. Suddenly, my day was all about him. We spent hours in the waiting room while he got stitches, and I didn't even get to open my presents until the next day. That was when I realized that I didn't matter to my parents anymore. Nathan was the center of their world, and there was nothing I could do to change that. I felt angry, hurt, and jealous all at once. As time went on, I became increasingly desperate for attention. I acted out, misbehaved, and threw tantrums, but nothing seemed to get through to my parents. They were too focused on Nathan's needs to notice me. Looking back, I can see now that I was just a child, overwhelmed with emotions and feeling left out. But at the time, I couldn't see past my jealousy and hurt. I felt like my parents had abandoned me for my brother, and I didn't know how to cope with those feelings. As I grew older, my attempts to get attention became more extreme. I started by faking illnesses, like getting colds or pretending to have a fever, but that didn't seem to work. My parents would give me some attention for a little while, but then they would be back to focusing on Nathan again. So I started to escalate my behavior. I would intentionally hurt myself, hoping that the injuries would be serious enough to get my parents' attention. I would burn myself on the stove or cut myself with a knife. Each time I did something like this, I would feel a mix of pain and relief. Pain from the physical injury, but relief that someone was finally paying attention to me. But even that wasn't enough. My parents would bandage me up and give me some sympathy, but then they would go back to their routines. Nathan's needs always came first. I felt like I was drowning in a sea of neglect and jealousy. As I grew older, my self-harm became more extreme. I started climbing trees and jumping off, hoping to break a bone. Once, I even intentionally caught a virus from a classmate, hoping to get sick enough to be hospitalized. But even that didn't work. My parents would give me some attention, but then they would be back to focusing on Nathan again. It was around this time that I started to seriously consider doing something permanent. Something that would force my parents to take notice of me and care for me in the same way they did for Nathan. I thought about it for weeks, planning and plotting, until I finally came to a decision. I was going to cut off my left arm. It was a drastic decision, but in my mind, it was the only way to get the attention I craved. I couldn't keep hurting myself and expecting my parents to care. But if I removed my arm, it would be impossible for them to ignore me. I would be just like Nathan, someone who needed constant care and attention. Looking back, I can see now that this was a terrible decision, one that would have lifelong consequences. But at the time, it seemed like the only option. I was so desperate for attention and love that I was willing to go to any lengths to get it. It was a warm summer day when I finally made the decision to cut off my left arm. My parents were out running errands, and I knew I had to act quickly. I went into the kitchen and found the sharpest knife I could find. I took a deep breath and rolled up my sleeve, exposing my left arm. I hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of what I was about to do. But then, with a sudden thrust, I plunged the knife into my left arm, just above the elbow. I screamed in pain as blood poured out of my wound, but I managed to keep the knife in place until my parents arrived home. When they saw what had happened, they were shocked and horrified. They rushed me to the hospital, but it was too late. I had lost too much blood, and my arm couldn't be saved. The days and weeks that followed were a blur of pain and trauma. I was in and out of consciousness, undergoing multiple surgeries and procedures to stabilize my condition. My parents were devastated, blaming themselves for neglecting me and not recognizing the extent of my pain and jealousy. As I lay in the hospital bed, I had a lot of time to think. I realized too late that hurting myself was never going to bring me the love and attention I craved. It was a desperate and misguided attempt to fill a void that couldn't be filled with physical pain. My parents were by my side throughout my recovery, but I could sense the guilt and sadness behind their eyes. They tried their best to be supportive, but the damage had been done. I had permanently altered my body and my life in pursuit of something that was never really there to begin with. Looking back, I can see now that my decision was a tragic one that would haunt me for the rest of my life. But at the time, I was consumed by desperation and a deep sense of neglect. I thought that by hurting myself, I could finally get the attention and love that I craved. But all I got was a lifetime of regret and pain. After the accident, my life changed completely. I had to relearn how to do everything with just one arm, from tying my shoes to eating to brushing my teeth. It was frustrating, painful, and isolating. Physical therapy became a part of my daily routine. I worked with a therapist to build up the strength in my remaining arm and to learn new ways to do things. But no matter how hard I tried, I always felt like something was missing. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had ruined my life and my body for nothing. The emotional toll of the accident was just as great as the physical one. I felt like a freak, like everyone was staring at me wherever I went. I avoided going out in public as much as possible, feeling ashamed and embarrassed of my missing limb. I felt like I was no longer a whole person, like a part of me had been taken away forever. My parents tried their best to be supportive, but things were never the same between us. There was a sadness and a distance between us that I couldn't bridge. I knew they loved me, but I also knew that they would never be able to look at me without seeing what I had done to myself. As the years went by, I learned to adapt to life with one arm. I found new hobbies and interests that I could pursue, like photography and writing. I made new friends who accepted me for who I was, not what I looked like. But even so, the pain and trauma of the accident never completely went away. I still had days where I felt overwhelmed by regret and guilt, where I wished I could turn back time and make a different decision. Looking back now, I can see that my decision to cut off my arm was a tragic one, born out of desperation and a deep sense of neglect. I wish I could tell my younger self that there were other ways to get the love and attention I craved, that hurting myself was never going to be the answer. But I can't change the past. All I can do is learn from it and try to move forward with grace and forgiveness. As I grew older, I learned to come to terms with the consequences of my actions. I sought therapy and counseling to deal with the trauma and guilt of what I had done. I spoke openly with my parents about how I was feeling, and we worked together to rebuild our relationship. But even so, the regret and guilt never completely went away. There were days when I still felt like I had made the biggest mistake of my life. I knew that I would never be able to get back what I had lost, but I also knew that I had to find a way to move forward. One of the things that helped me the most was connecting with other people who had experienced similar struggles. I joined a support group for people with disabilities and met others who had lost limbs or suffered traumatic injuries. Being around people who understood what I was going through was a tremendous comfort, and I felt less alone and isolated. Over time, I also learned to forgive myself for what I had done. I realized that I had been a child, overwhelmed by jealousy and hurt, and that I had made a terrible mistake. But I also knew that I had grown and learned from that mistake, and that I was a better person because of it. Today, I try to focus on the positive aspects of my life. I have a successful career, a loving partner, and a supportive group of friends and family. I still struggle with the aftermath of the accident, but I know that I am stronger and more resilient because of it. Looking back now, I can see that my decision to cut off my arm was a tragic one, born out of a deep sense of neglect and jealousy. But I also know that I have learned from that experience and grown as a person. I have learned the importance of seeking help and support when I need it, of being honest with myself and others, and of forgiving myself for my mistakes.